Hey, it's Mark from Power BI at Work. Thank you for joining yet another video where we're going to discuss, again, the sequence of calculate and how those filters work sequentially and those modifiers work sequentially to bring us back this concept of new filter context. If you remember from last time, we started out here talking about the original filters that are coming from the canvas of our report. And so we spent a lot of time here looking at this cell right here as it loads, right there. Masking tape, $60, vendor 3M. We were collecting these labels in the container of calculate and then going back to the model and envisioning that model filtering down to just the rows in our sales table that survive that are relevant to masking tape, and that was $60. And then we kept going and then realizing that as we move around this visual, these filters in our calculate change. But one thing's for sure, calculate is the reason for filter context. And so in this next step, what we're going to talk about is that next step 2 in calculate's process of processing filters and modifications of filters. And this step right here is what this has in common with step 1 is that it also happens automatically and it's also unseen. So these two kind of work hand in hand under the covers of calculate, but they both together set the foundation of original filters as we progress through the different steps of calculate. So before we get too far, I want to go back to the table here and just get some terminology out of the way as it pertains to row context and this idea of turning row context into model filters. So let's go to the sales table. Back when I was pretty early learning DAX, I was intimidated by iterators such as SumX. So what I would do is I would spend some time back in a physical table and just play around with calculated columns. And so I would do something like this, where I would just reference this total sales column from a new formula here. And let's call this total sales 2. Total sales 2. And I might just reference total sales in this table. I'm referencing that column reference and I hit enter. And I know that row by row should give me the 35, the 24, and the 10. And indeed it does. But last week we learned that when we write measures, we need to include a aggregation like sum, average, max, min. So let's see what happens here if we wrap a sum around this column reference. Now, early me would say, well, I should get the same result because I know that I'm in a row context environment. Each row, its world is only that current row. So I should be summing 35, 24, and 10. But indeed, you can see that what happens is I am summing the entire column unfiltered. And so what I would take from this is a good reminder that that filter context by default does not live in this table environment or this row by row environment. We saw that it did on the canvas and it threw an automatic calculate anytime we touched that canvas or put some aggregation on it, but that same behavior does not happen here. I can wrap a calculate around it. This is becoming our magic function, but when I wrap that function around it, I do indeed get back $35. And what that's called, or what this is doing, is it's triggering filter context just as it did on that canvas, and it's pulling visible labels from its environment. In this case, it's not surrounding labels on a canvas, but it's It's those labels that are isolated to each row. And so some terminology here is when I go away from that row context and I'm forcing filter context, we call that context transition. And the result of context transition gives me what is called not filter context, but equivalent filter context. It's called equivalent filter context because we're filtering over the table itself, and we also may run the risk of doubling up on this aggregated result in the case that we have additional rows below our current row that are identical to this row. So just something to be careful of. Definitely not best practice. I wouldn't recommend writing calculated columns until you can really appreciate what you're adding to your model, but definitely good for education purposes. Let's go back to our report and let's talk a little bit about this visual right here. So I'm setting up this example where I'm trying to illustrate the effect of adding context transition within our measure. If we go back here, we see that we're right here in step 2, and it says I want to turn table rows into filters, just like we did in that table. And that's called context transition. And the effect of it will remove and replace the matching or the conflicting filters from this first step here. And so we're going to show that here in this example. So what I've done here is created a slicer filter here called a hierarchy. And what this does is it allows me to separate different slicers within higher levels of filtering. So you can see my hierarchy here has month followed by week. And my desire is that in my visual, I want to filter the last 2 weeks of January and the first 2 weeks of February separately. So I call this a combo hierarchy because this creates technically an arbitrary shape set, but what this hierarchy slicer allows me to do is combine January specifically with these 2 weeks, and then February specifically with these 2 weeks. And you can see here in the grand total, I have a reduced value. And I'm showing those weeks isolated under each month there. Well, I've written this measure ahead of time, and it's called total sales wrong. So we can imagine that it's already wrong. But let's just take a look at this measure and let's drag it into our, well, let's wait and then we'll drag it in. But instead of using sum like we did last time, I'm using sum x. And sum x extends my measure out to require, I'm going to take that out because that, sum x extends my measure to include a requirement for a table here. And when I use values, which is a table function, when I use values over my timetable and I'm referencing the column of week, what I'm doing is I'm providing a unique list of week labels or week labels from that column that are in the current filter context. And then the second argument, you'll see this comma here, the second argument of my sum x is my total sales measure. So that's my expression. One thing to point out here is that if I wrote a sum here over my sales column in my table, I would get a very similar result as we did when I did that example back in that table where I wrote that aggregation around that column reference, or yeah, that column reference. And the reason is because although we're in a measure here and there is indeed a calculate wrapped around this, we don't have to write this, but we're going to write it just to remember that there's an outer calculate here. But if we are in this nested measure here inside of this calculate, I know that that sum x is automatically putting these two arguments in that table environment, in that row context environment. So if we wrote sum here, we would get an inflated result. If we just reference the measure that we already wrote last time, I am inherently calling on calculate in this measure. So calculate happens when we write a measure, just period. Filter context, we can see when we pull that on the canvas. But when we reference measures from other measures, it also brings in that calculate feature inherent to this measure. So just like we were in that table, we know that if we're living in row context here, and instead of being in a physical table, we're in a virtual table that we created out of these values, and our expression in that table is a calculate of this measure. Can't see the calculate, but it's there. We know that context transition is happening here. So we've got a calculate here, right there, that we can't see. And we've also got a calculate out here that's working on these original filters right there. Two calculates, okay? So you can imagine that this outer calculate is including the hierarchy, which is a special filter that combines these into isolated months. We're filtering month and week. And then you can see here, we've got our hidden calculate right there. We're also filtering by week. So that's the reason that we're going to come back here to step 2. If we come back here, this is the reason why we have to have a priority. It's because we've got a calculate, an outer calculate pulling these filters in. We've got an inner calculate in that sum x that's also contending for the position. And we already know by the order here of priority that this one should take precedence. But let's go back here and let's move on and see what happens when we pull in this measure into our visual. And we can see that those competing filters are causing an issue, not at this level. The current filter context is not making a difference here as we progress down our column, but you can see at the grand total, we've got an unexpected result of 686, and we know that 686 is indeed our grand total. So what's going on here? Well, if we think about the current filter context here, and we look at all the surrounding labels in the slicer, in the rows, in the columns, we know that it includes both months, January and February, all 4 weeks, 1, 2, 3, and 4, as defined by our outer filters here in this hierarchy. But what's happening in this measure to bring back that inflated result is that we're seeing the effect of this table right here through context transition. Remember, we've got the calculate right there, creating additional competing filters against the outer calculate, which would be this hierarchy right here. And because this is context transition, and this is defined as number 2 in our sequence, we know that this is overwriting this filter right here. So let's try to illustrate that, or just see that in a separate page. So what I've done here is illustrate that we've got the hierarchy here, and then we've got a competing filter right there, context transition step 2, which is in the background within our measure, also filtering that same week value field. And you can see that we've got 277 still here, but we've got 686 here. Now let's move on and realize that this step 2 is actually replacing or taking precedence over the week values in this hierarchy filter right here. If we actually do that and we remove those filters, this is actually what's happening. So I've taken out the measure just to highlight what happens in the regular sum. And you can see here, we've got the same result. So because we've introduced this new filter, and this new filter on week has taken precedence over our hierarchy, it actually knocks out the weeks from this filter. And what we're left with are now two separate filters that are filtering over our model. January and February, we're at this level here. January and February. So we're imagining the timetable reduced down to only the January and February rows. But then we're also introducing this completely separate filter now from the context transition that is iterating over week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4. And that's why we have consistent results all the way down. But at the very bottom, we have that grand total in that sales wrong. So it's easy to see here. It's very consistent down here. It's less obvious when you're back here at that original step and you've just got this report filter visible, and we're not necessarily seeing with our eyes that context transition filter being added here and overriding and knocking these out. So that's why we have 277 there under the original measure, and then 686, that unexpected result there. What can we do to protect this? Granted, this is kind of a unique edge case example anyway. I don't imagine that I would ever use this in an actual report. But if we had to contend with this, and we had this measure right here, and this was our measure, for educational purposes, what could we add to this measure that would protect this hierarchy from being overridden, these values or these labels being kicked out? Well, we're going to learn more about this as we progress, but it's not going to happen until the very end. Step 5 is a function called keep filters, which is a table modifier. If we come back to that example, this is just kind of a preview of next time, but we lock this wrong spot. It's got to go around the table. This extra calculate's messing me up. If we surround our virtual table here of values with a keep filters, what we're essentially doing is we're protecting the outer filters from, hold on, sorry. Let's just get rid of that extra calculate. SumX keep filters values total sales. Work. There we go. So what we're doing by using keep filters is we're essentially putting a lock, or I like to say a bear hug, around these values right here, and we're preventing them from escaping and overriding and shoving these values out. So if we put keep filters there, it's essentially like doing this here, where we have both active filters active at the same time. So keep filters around the step 2 filters here will prevent them from reaching over here and kicking those out. All right, well, that's how I envision step 2. Next time, we're going to talk about step 3, where we start explicitly adding to our calculate. And step 3 is going to be calculate modifiers, remove filters, cross filter, use relationship. So we'll talk about that next time. Again, thanks for watching. If this helped you out, please hit like down below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.